For over 100 years, these photographs sat buried in newspapers, circus archives, and forgotten collections. And every single person you're about to see was real. Some were exploited, some became stars, some were treated more like animals than human beings. And behind the posters and ticket sales were stories far darker than the audience ever realized, because one of these performers was so terrifying in real life that even his own family wanted him dead. Lobster Boy. On the night of November 29, 1992, a hired gunman knocked on the door of a trailer in Gibsonton, Florida, and shot Grady Styles Jr. twice in the back of the head. The killer had been paid $500. The person who ordered the hit was his own wife, Teresa. Grady Styles Jr. was born in 1937 with ectrodactyly. This genetic condition fused the bones of his hands and feet into elongated, claw-shaped appendages that circus posters called his lobster claws. He came from a family with the same condition going back multiple generations, all of them performers, and he had been on stage since he was 7 years old. He could not walk. He moved on his hands and the stumps of his forearms with a speed that observers consistently described as startling. He shot and killed his daughter's fiancé in 1978, the night before her wedding, because he disapproved of the marriage. He was convicted of third-degree murder. No prison would take him because his condition required medical accommodation that they said they could not provide. He received 15 years probation and returned to the road. By the time Teresa arranged his death, she had decided the system that could not jail him could not protect her either. The jury, after hearing the full account of life in that trailer, recommended leniency. Echo and Eco. Sometime around 1914, on a tobacco field outside the small town of Truvine, Virginia, a circus promoter named James Shelton approached two young black boys who were working in the rows and offered them candy. George and Willie Muse were the grandsons of former slaves, both born with albinism, their skin pale and their hair growing in long white dreadlocks that circus management would spend years fashioning into increasingly elaborate promotional fictions. They were told they would perform for a few days. They did not come home for 13 years. The brothers were billed under a rotating series of identities: the white Ecuadorian cannibals, the sheep-headed men, and eventually, in tuxedos, the ambassadors from Mars. They were not paid beyond room and board. When they cried for their mother, they were told she was dead. She was not dead. Harriet Muse spent 13 years fighting every institution available to her: law enforcement, the Humane Society of Virginia, and anyone who would listen, and none of them helped her. In the fall of 1927, Ringling Brothers came through Roanoke. Harriet Muse saw it in a dream first, then confirmed it in the newspaper, and she was at the tent before it opened. She found her sons behind the curtain. She sued Ringling Brothers for back wages and won a settlement that allowed the brothers to keep performing, this time on their own terms and for real pay. Willie Muse died in 2001 at the age of 108. He had outlived everyone. The Bear Woman. In 1857, a London audience watched Julia Pastana sing operatic arias in Spanish, English, and French, then stood in silence before the applause broke. She had hypertrichosis terminalis, producing thick dark hair across her face, ears, and body, combined with gingival hyperplasia that caused her gums to grow over her teeth and alter the structure of her mouth. Her promoters billed her as a hybrid of human and animal. She was a trained singer and dancer who spoke multiple languages, yet those facts never appeared in any promotional material about her. She died in 1860 after giving birth in Moscow to a child who had the same condition and survived only 3 days. Her manager and husband, Theodore Lent, sold both her body and the body of her infant to a professor of anatomy at Moscow University, who had them mummified and placed on display. Her remains were exhibited in sideshows for over 150 years, stolen twice, recovered twice, and abused in ways that no legal protection prevented because no one tried to provide any. It was not until 2013 that she was finally returned to Mexico and buried in her home state of Sinaloa with a ceremony that took 153 years to arrive. The Hilton Sisters. Daisy and Violet Hilton were born in Brighton, England in 1907, joined at the hip by a band of shared pelvic tissue that gave each full sensation in her own body and partial sensation in her sister's. Their mother, an unmarried barmaid, sold them at birth to her midwife Mary Hilton for an undisclosed sum. Mary Hilton exhibited them as curiosities, kept all earnings, controlled every aspect of their lives, and when she died, left them as property to her daughter and son-in-law. They were not free. They were not compensated. They were not permitted to speak to strangers without permission. They had been on stage since infancy and had never known anything else. By the 1920s, they were appearing in vaudeville across America and had become famous enough to play themselves in the 1932 film Freaks, directed by Todd Browning. In 1931, they sued for their freedom in a Texas courtroom. The judge awarded it. They received no back pay for 2 decades of earnings. They attempted nightclub careers. They toured until the bookings stopped. They were found dead in their Charlotte, North Carolina apartment in January 1969, both having died within a few days of each other from the Hong Kong flu. The grocery store where they worked had noticed they hadn't come in. No one else had checked. That no one checked is the most precise summary of what the industry felt about them once the ticket money was gone. The Elephant Man. On the night of April 11, 1890, Joseph Merrick was found dead in his room at the London hospital, seated upright, having apparently tried to sleep lying down. His head, which measured 36 inches in circumference and weighed approximately 12 pounds, could not be supported by his neck in any reclined position without obstructing his airway. The coroner's ruling was accidental asphyxia. He was 27 years old. Merrick had been born in Leicester in 1862 and began developing the severe bone and skin overgrowths that would alter his entire face, skull, and right side of his body from early childhood. The condition is now attributed most plausibly to Proteus syndrome, a rare genetic overgrowth disorder. He was exhibited in London freak shops beginning in his late teens, then moved to continental Europe, and was rescued by Frederick Treves, a surgeon at the London hospital, who secured him permanent lodging there for the final 4 years of his life. In those 4 years, he received visits from actress Mrs. Kendall, letters from Princess Alexandra, and an annual Christmas pantomime outing to the theater. He made intricate cardboard models of churches in his spare time and gave them as gifts. His model of St. Philip's Church in Bethnal Green was displayed in his room at the time of his death. The most careful description of what he did during those 4 years is that he practiced being a person with people who treated him like one, and that it took 4 years because before Trevis, he had had few opportunities. The original Siamese twins. Chang and Ang Bunker were born in 1811 in Siam, now Thailand, joined at the sternum by a band of cartilaginous tissue roughly 5 inches long that contained a shared liver lobe. Scottish merchant Robert Hunter discovered them, brought them to the United States in 1829, and exhibited them by P.T. Barnum, who coined the term Siamese twins and applied it to 2 men who had a country, names, and a language that had nothing to do with that label. They eventually won ownership of their own contracts, settled in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, purchased a plantation, and in 1843 married 2 sisters, Adelaide and Sarah Yates. The wedding generated news coverage across the country. They maintained 2 separate homes and alternated 3-day visits, a domestic arrangement that required constant negotiation between 2 men who had no choice but to share everything else. Between them, they fathered 21 children. Chang developed a severe drinking problem and suffered a stroke in 1870 that left him significantly weakened. Ang remained in better health. In January 1874, Chang died in the night. Ang, joined to him and unable to move, is believed to have survived his brother's death by several hours, aware of what had happened and unable to change it. The post-mortem revealed that the liver bridge between them could have been safely divided at almost any point during their lives. No surgeon ever tried. Joyce Heth. In 1835, P.T. Barnum was 25 years old and had not yet become P.T. Barnum. The thing that made him was the purchase of a woman. Joyce Heth was an enslaved black woman who was blind, paralyzed, and nearly toothless, marketed by her exhibitors as 161 years old, and as having been the nurse of the infant George Washington. Her teeth had been extracted before the exhibition to make her appear more ancient. Barnum paid $1,000 for exclusive rights to exhibit her, toured her through New England for 8 months at 25 cents a head, and generated enough newspaper coverage to make himself a recognizable name in the promotional business. She died in February 1836. Barnum then did something that defined his entire career. He sold tickets to a public autopsy, performed by a surgeon before 1,500 paying audience members, to resolve the question of whether she was really as old as advertised. The autopsy found she was approximately 80 years old, half the billed age. Barnum's response was to suggest to the press that perhaps the woman who died was a different woman, and the real Joyce Heth was alive somewhere else. He was 26 years old, and he had just learned that the exposure of a lie can be monetized as an event in its own right. The entire architecture of American entertainment over the next 60 years rested on that discovery. The four-legged woman from Texas. She had 4 legs, 5 children, and let the photographs do the talking. Josephine Myrtle Corbin was born in Lincoln County, Tennessee in 1868 with dipigus, a form of partial twinning that produced a second fully developed pelvis attached between her own outer legs, complete with 2 additional inner legs that were fully formed but too weak to support weight. She had, in documented medical fact, 4 legs. The Eisenman studio photographs taken of her in the 1880s show all 4 clearly, and those photos sold in the thousands. She began performing at 13 and was earning $250 a week by the late 1880s, a wage that placed her well above most professional workers in America at the time. She married at 18 a physician named Clinton Bicknell, and together they had 5 children. Medical accounts from physicians who examined her later in life suggested that 3 children were carried in her own womb and 2 in her smaller secondary reproductive system. She retired from exhibition to raise her family in Claiborne, Texas, and died in 1909 at 40. The photographs outlasted everything else by over a century. They are still the first thing people encounter when they search her name, which is how she would have wanted it, given that she chose, whenever possible, to let the physical fact of her body speak for itself, rather than allow a promoter to speak for it instead. Lionel, the lion-faced man. Stefan Bibrowski was born in Poland in 1891 with hypertrichosis universalis, producing long, fine hair covering his entire face and body, with growth around his head that reached 6 inches, and which his promoters arranged to resemble a lion's mane. His mother, in an act that says something about the era's understanding of medicine, told exhibitors she believed his condition was caused by her having witnessed a lion attack during her pregnancy. The story was biologically implausible and commercially useful, and it appeared in promotional material for the next 30 years. He was taken from his family by a German impresario as a child, exhibited across Europe, and eventually brought to Barnum and Bailey, where he became one of the most recognized performers in America. He spoke 5 languages. Journalists who interviewed him consistently described a thoughtful, soft-spoken man whose temperament was in every way the precise opposite of the savage persona constructed around him. His act involved being introduced in a cage, then speaking, reasoning, and discussing current events in multiple languages. At the same time, the crowd processed the distance between what the billing had prepared them for and what they were actually seeing. He retired to Germany in the 1920s and died there in 1932 at 40. The 3-legged man. Seeing the man with a real third leg was something that circus lovers were never going to pass up. Franchesco Lentini was born in Rosellini, Sicily in 1889 with a parasitic twin that attached to his lower spine and produced a functional third leg, a 4th foot, and 16 toes. He immigrated to the United States at 8 and was performing within a year. He learned to use the third leg as a step stool, a prop, and a kicking mechanism, and his signature crowd act was to punt a football across the stage with it while standing on the other 2, a trick that required balance he had to develop deliberately over years of practice. He spoke 4 languages. He married and had 4 children. He attributed his relentlessly cheerful disposition to a single visit he made early in his career to a school for children with severe disabilities. He said afterward that he had never complained about his own situation since, because there was always someone whose circumstances were measurably harder. He toured for more than 50 years, performed into his mid-60s, and died in Florida in 1966. He had outlived Barnum, outlived vaudeville, outlived the golden age of the sideshow itself, and was still performing when his heart finally gave out. The last of the Aztecs. The man known as Schlitzy was probably born as Simon Metz, probably in the Bronx, probably around 1890, with microcephaly, a condition in which the brain and skull do not develop to full size. His intellectual capacity, by the accounts of everyone who observed him, was approximately that of a 3-year-old. His social warmth, by those same accounts, was unlimited. His promoters dressed him in muumuus and referred to him with feminine pronouns because they found audiences were more receptive to a pin-headed girl. He was billed as a surviving Aztec, an ancient cave creature, and a specimen of a species distinct from modern humans, all of which were complete fictions. He appears in Todd Browning's 1932 film Freaks, and he is the most compelling presence in it, not because anyone directed him to be, but because he genuinely enjoyed people, and it is visible in every frame. What his situation reveals about the sideshow economy is its particular cruelty toward those who could not read a contract, consent to an interview, or understand what was being done to them. He survived the era entirely because other performers looked after him, a protection network constructed of human decency in the absence of any institutional equivalent. He died in Los Angeles in 1971 in a care home, having outlived vaudeville, the sideshow circuit, and almost everyone who had ever exhibited him. The human torso. Even without arms or legs, Prince Randian had a level of self-sufficiency that made audiences forget what they came to see. Born in British Guiana in 1871 with complete tetra amelia syndrome, a condition in which no limbs develop during gestation, he was brought to the United States by Barnum in 1892 and performed continuously for the next 45 years. He taught himself to shave, paint, write, and roll and light cigarettes using only his mouth, teeth, and chin. The cigarette rolling sequence that appears in the 1932 film Freaks remains the most documented record of his dexterity, and it shows a precision that was clearly the product of years of practiced repetition. He spoke 4 languages. His wife traveled with him for decades. He negotiated his own billing and expressed clear preferences about how his act was presented. He died in 1952 at 80, which by any standard of reasoning for a man without limbs receiving the medical care available in the first half of the 20th century represents a constitutional strength that had nothing to do with the spectacle his promoters sold. The spectacle was real. It was just the least interesting thing about him. General Tom Thumb. In January 1844, a 5-year-old boy from Bridgeport, Connecticut, who stood 25 inches tall and weighed 15 pounds, was introduced to Queen Victoria at Buckingham Palace. He performed for her, impersonated Napoleon, danced, sang, and reportedly made her laugh loudly enough to surprise her own courtiers. His name was Charles Sherwood Stratton, and Barnum had found him a year earlier, recognized immediately that what he had was not a small child but a natural entertainer, and had spent 12 months training him to sing, dance, and do impersonations before presenting him to a public that immediately and utterly adored him. He grew to a final height of 40 inches. He toured Europe 3 times and performed for royalty across the continent. In 1863, he married another little person, Lavinia Warren, because in terms of public attention, it essentially was. Their wedding photograph, taken by Matthew Brady, became one of the decade's best-selling prints. He died in 1883 at 45, a wealthy man who had spent his entire adult life as one of the most recognized performers on earth and who had, in the estimation of most people who knew him, genuinely enjoyed it. The human pincushion. On May 23, 1947, in an auditorium in Zurich, a Dutch performer named Arnold Gerrit Henskes, who called himself Mirin Dajo, allowed an assistant to drive a hollow steel foil entirely through his torso, entering below his left shoulder and exiting below his right, piercing what should have been multiple organs. He did not bleed. The images were published. No accepted medical explanation was produced then, and none has been produced since. However, theories include years of gradual internal repositioning of organs through deliberate practice and an unusual degree of scar tissue formation along the path of repeated penetration. He believed his ability was divinely granted, a demonstration that the physical world was an illusion. Swiss authorities banned him from performing in the country after the 1947 demonstration because it was too dangerous to permit. He swallowed a steel needle shortly afterward. X-rays showed it moving through his digestive system without visible harm. In May 1949, 2 years after Zurich, He died of an aortic rupture in a Swiss sanatorium. The cause was not formally linked to his acts. The timing has been noted in every medical account written about him since. The Bearded Lady. Annie Jones was born in Virginia in 1865 with severe hirsutism that produced a full beard and mustache by her teenage years, extending several inches from her chin. P.T. Barnum found her when she was 9 months old. Her impoverished parents agreed to let her be exhibited. She was photographed with Barnum at the age of 2, already billed as the infant Esau, and from that point was on the road almost continuously for the rest of her childhood and young adulthood. She grew up with opinions. As an adult, she apparently led an informal campaign among circus performers to remove the word freak from sideshow advertising, arguing decades before the language of disability rights existed that the word was inaccurate and dehumanizing. The campaign had a limited practical effect. She led it anyway. She married twice. She divorced her first husband, her manager. She outlived her second. She gave interviews in which she described her circus childhood as, in her words, not entirely unpleasant but not a life she would have selected. She died in 1902 at 37. The last programs printed for her performances described her simply as a woman with a beard, because she had spent 20 years insisting that was the only truly true thing about her, and had kept insisting until the people writing the copy listened. The Legless Acrobat. 67 years in the circus, and not once was he just standing there being looked at. Eli Bowen was born in Ohio in 1844 with phocomelia, a limb difference that left him with no legs and small, rudimentary feet attached directly to his hips. He learned to move on his hands from early childhood. He developed upper body strength throughout his teenage years, eventually enabling him to perform pole acrobatics, hand balancing, and gymnastic routines that would have been physically demanding for any performer. He joined his first circus at the age of 13. He performed for 60 years. He married in 1879, had 4 sons, all born with full limbs, and raised them in and around the circus world he had never left. He was among the highest-paid performers of the Barnum and Bailey era, and he reached that position not by being displayed but by developing an act that required real skill and by continuing to refine it for 6 decades. He made a final public appearance at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco at the age of 71, and the crowd that turned out made clear that 60 years had not diminished either the act or the affection the audience held for the man performing it. He died in 1924 at 80, having spent 67 years in the circus as a performer rather than a subject. Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy. Between shows, he read quietly and spoke 4 languages. When the curtain went up, he growled. Fedor Jeftichew was born in St. Petersburg in 1868, the son of Adrian Jeftichew, who had the same condition and had been exhibited in European traveling fairs for decades. The condition was hypertrichosis, producing long, silky hair covering the face, ears, and upper body in a pattern that his promoters, specifically Barnum, described as resembling the coat of a Skye Terrier. Barnum acquired him in 1884, renamed him Jojo, invented an origin story about him being captured in the Russian wilderness in a wild state, and required him to growl, bark, and perform as if he understood no human language. He spoke 4 languages. Every backstage account described him as soft-spoken, private, and acutely embarrassed by the role he was required to perform. Between shows, he read quietly and spoke normally to anyone who approached him in a language they shared. When the curtain went up, he growled. The pay was better than anything else available to a man in his situation, which is the most honest explanation for why most people in this industry stayed. He died in 1894 in Thessaloniki at 26 of pneumonia while on tour in Greece. His father, who had made the same accommodation his entire working life, outlived him by years. Neither of them ever chose the act. Both of them gave it anyway. The Living Skeleton. Isaac Sprague had an entirely ordinary appearance until around age 12, when he stopped gaining weight while continuing to grow. By his late teens, he weighed under 60 pounds at a height of 5 feet 6 inches. Multiple physicians examined him across his lifetime and identified no conclusive diagnosis. The most plausible modern attribution is a severe form of progressive muscular atrophy in which the musculature never adequately developed, producing an extreme structural thinness distinct from starvation. Barnum signed him in 1865. He weighed 43 pounds at the time. He was a married man with 3 children, and he drank milk continuously from a flask during performances to maintain whatever energy he had. He retired in the mid-1880s and fell into poverty within a year, having earned regularly and saved very little. He returned to the sideshow circuit in his 50s because there was no alternative source of income. He died in 1887 at 46. His wife and 3 children were left without financial support. His case appears in historical medical literature under the heading of extreme emaciation, presented as a diagnostic puzzle, with no accompanying note about the family he left behind when the puzzle became irrelevant. Cuckoo the Bird Girl. Minnie Woolsey was born with Seckle syndrome, a rare form of primordial dwarfism characterized by an extremely small skull, a narrow-beaked nose, large eyes relative to her face, absent teeth, and a small, fragile frame that, at adult height, stood barely 4 feet tall. She was performing in sideshows by the 1920s, billed as Cuckoo the Bird Girl. She appeared in Todd Browning's 1932 film Freaks, in a feathered costume that had clearly been designed specifically around her features, rather than fitted to her from an existing pattern, because the effect is too precise to have been accidental. She moves through her scenes with a quick, darting motion that promoters had rehearsed into her, and the camera catches it as somewhere between deliberate performance and something more essential. What Freaks does not show is anything from off-camera because no one recorded it. Her actual birth date, her legal name, the circumstances of her entry into the sideshow industry, the date and circumstances of her death, and the details of her inner life are all either uncertain or entirely lost. The Wild Men of Borneo. Hiram and Barney Davis were the sons of a farmer and lived entirely ordinary rural lives until a showman named Lyman Warner convinced their mother to let him exhibit them as wild savages freshly captured from the jungles of Borneo. They were small, stocky, and physically powerful, capable of feats of strength and acrobatic displays that Warner incorporated into an act that toured America for over 60 years. They spoke no Bornean languages. They had never been to Borneo. They communicated during performances in a rapid stage gibberish that their management had developed with them to support the fiction of an alien origin. The strength demonstrations, in which both men together lifted and supported adult audience members, were entirely genuine. They were managed by their brother William, who traveled with them as their official handler and received a salary for the role. They earned well and retired to New Jersey, where they lived quietly for the rest of their lives. Hiram died in 1905. Barney in 1912. Their story's most characteristic detail is the one the promoters never put on the poster: 2 Ohio farm boys, performing as cannibals from another continent, who returned home every winter to exactly the rural American life they had always had and had never left behind. Jack Earl. Jacob Ehrlich was born in Denver, Colorado in 1906. He reached his full adult height of 7 feet 7.5 inches by his late teens, the result of a pituitary tumor producing unchecked growth hormone. Ringling Brothers found him at 17 and signed him under the name Jack Earl, placing him at the opposite end of the promotional spectrum from Tom Thumb's legacy, as evidence that the circus contained the full human range from smallest to tallest. He was not simply a tall man standing still to be measured. He was a willing and engaged performer who, throughout his time in the circus, was also a serious working artist. He painted, he sculpted, he wrote poetry. In 1940, he resigned from performing, moved to San Francisco, and spent the rest of his life as a wine salesman and visual artist, achieving modest professional recognition in both capacities on their own merits. He died in 1952 at 46, the pituitary condition that made him famous having aged his body significantly faster than normal growth would have. His paintings are held in private collections. He is one of a very small number of people from the sideshow era who fully transitioned into another life and made it work, without pretending the first life had not existed. The Two-Headed Mexican. Sometime around 1917, a man named Pascal Pinon was hired by the Sells Floto Circus to wear a sculpted wax mask in the shape of a human face attached to the top of his head, sit on a specially built platform, and be presented to paying audiences as the most astonishing freak of nature in the world, a two-headed man. The second head was a wax prop, cast from a mold, painted to resemble a human face in repose. It was mounted on a raised area of his skull that may have been a natural growth or may have been a padded framework built into the exhibition apparatus itself. The circus promoted him as a Mexican railway worker discovered in the fields of Texas who had spent his whole life concealing his second face beneath a sombrero, a story that was entirely constructed. What is confirmed is that Pinon was a real man, a genuine circus employee who was paid to perform this particular deception for several years, who appeared in promotional photographs that circulated widely at the time, and who then exited the historical record as completely as he had entered it. The Ohio Bigfoot Girl. Fanny Mills was born in England and came to the United States as a child, eventually settling in Ohio, where she was found by circus promoters who recognized in her condition something they could sell at scale. She had Milroy disease, a primary lymphedema affecting the lymphatic drainage system. In her case, the condition had concentrated entirely in her feet, which by the time she was exhibiting measured approximately 19 inches in length. Her shoes were specially constructed and displayed alongside her as props. She was billed as the Ohio Bigfoot Girl and toured major American circuits through the 1880s. The most striking element of her promotional campaign was a standing offer of $5,000 and a working Ohio farm to any man willing to marry her, a publicity stunt designed to produce newspaper coverage, and it succeeded reliably in every new town the circus visited. A female companion traveled with her, billed as her nurse, whose role was partly logistical and partly performative, her presence implying constant medical supervision that reinforced the exhibition's sense of authentic abnormality. Fanny Mills did eventually marry a man named Henry Brown, not through the contest but by her own arrangement. She retired after the marriage. What happened in the years that followed is not recorded, as is typical for women in her position once their commercial value expired. The Human Owl. Martin Laurello, born Martin Emmerling in Nuremberg, Germany in 1886, could rotate his head 180 degrees, bringing the back of his skull level with his shoulders. At the same time, his body faced forward so that his face looked directly behind him. He was not born with a condition enabling this. He developed it through years of deliberate practice, a phenomenon that physicians who examined him attributed to progressive overstretching of the anterior longitudinal ligaments of the cervical vertebrae, ligaments that in most humans never allow this range of motion under any circumstances. While fully rotated, blood flow to his brain was compromised, and he could not hold the position for extended periods without losing consciousness. He adjusted the duration of every performance to stay below that threshold. He smoked a cigarette during the act to give his hands and mouth something to occupy themselves while his face pointed backward. He performed at Ripley's Believe It or Not attractions, at Coney Island, and at major circus venues for 30 years. He died in 1955. From a medical standpoint, what he had done was construct a self-inflicted injury of the cervical spine precise enough to be performed on command. The Minnesota Willie Girl. The hair was golden, soft, and beautiful. Her promoters framed it as horror. Alice Elizabeth Doherty was born in Minneapolis in 1887 with hypertrichosis lanuginosa, an extremely rare condition in which the body produces fine, downy lanugo hair. This type covers fetuses and is normally shed before or shortly after birth. In her case, it covered her entire face and body in a long, soft, golden coat that contemporaries described as beautiful in a way that created genuine disorientation, because the hair's beauty sat in precise opposition to the horror framing her promoters placed around it. Her parents began exhibiting her at age 2. She had no memory of a life before the stage. She performed through her teens and 20s and retired in her late 20s, returning to Minneapolis, where she lived quietly for the rest of her life. She was not defrauded of her earnings the way the Hilton sisters were, nor exploited in death the way Julia Pastana was. Her family managed her affairs in a way that produced financial security. She died in 1933 at 46, leaving almost no personal record beyond the cabinet card photographs that were sold in the thousands during her performing years. The Camel Girl. Ella Harper was born in Hendersonville, Tennessee, in 1870, with a congenital bilateral knee recurvatum, a condition in which the knee joints hyperextend in reverse, so that when she walked on all fours, her legs bent backward in the posture of a camel's hind legs. She could walk upright with a shuffling gait if she chose. She generally preferred all fours because it was faster and more comfortable. And circus promoters, when they found her, recognized the visual potential immediately. She was earning $200 a week by 1886, which placed her among the better compensated performers in the industry. The most important document in her entire file is the text she wrote herself for the program card sold at her performances. In it, she describes her condition in plain factual language, states that she has appeared in the sideshow to earn money, and then closes by informing the reader that she intends to quit the business and get an education. A promoter does not copyright that. The voice in it is hers, and the intention behind it was carried out. She retired in her late teens and enrolled in school. After that, she disappears from the historical record so completely that no marriage, no death record, and no adult biography has ever been definitively located. Pony Boy. Robert Huddleston, known in the circus world as Pony Boy, was born in the late 19th century with a bilateral knee recurvatum condition similar to Ella Harper's, in which his joints bent in reverse, so that his natural mode of locomotion on all fours produced a gait that promoters described to audiences as equine. He performed continuously for 36 years. What the historical record contains is his name in circus rosters, his presence on stage across nearly 4 decades, and almost nothing else. He is among the least documented of all the major performers from this era, his personal history absorbed entirely by the act he gave. His name appears in circus records from the early 1900s through the 1930s, and then it stops. The performers who shared his world in those years left diaries, gave newspaper interviews, filed lawsuits, or at minimum wrote their own promotional copy. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.